Good morning, everyone. The story I have for you today happened about, in fact, exactly 30 years ago this May. I remember it as if it happened yesterday. The dreaded telephone call when our teenage children are growing up and are out late materialized and became a reality on the night of the 20th of May of 1989. The telephone call was going to herald the beginning of the most harrowing and horrendous experience that both my wife and I and the rest of the family had to go through 30 years ago. Mark, our son, had been revising for his exam, which he was going to take on the following Wednesday. This was a Saturday. He had spent the whole day indoors, immersed in his books. In the evening, his friend Richard, who was now working at Barclays Bank and the proud owner of a brand new Peugeot 205 bright red car, came for him and invited him to go along into Spain. At first, Mark resisted. But I suppose having spent the whole day with the books and the lure of spending some time with friends up the coast was too great, and in the end he relented. I remember the conversation that he had with Richard, and it left me a little bit uneasy, because at first he didn't want to go, but he gave in. Richard, I'm pleased to say, is with us today. He's here in the front seat. If you lift your hand, Richard, people can see where you are. I'm delighted that he's here with us now. They set off for Spain, and when it was time for bed, my wife and I retired, and we slept, and we received the dreaded telephone call in the middle of the night. The caller informed us that Mark had been involved in a particularly serious accident along the coast road. This was the old road. I'm talking about 1989, when the dual carriageway still had not been constructed. We were to make our way down to the police post, where we would be informed about details of where Mark was and what we should do. Like a flash, we dressed, sped down to Four Corners, and went to the British police post. There, Richard's family were, not his parents. His parents were in Camping Tugera, further up the coast that weekend, but his grandmother and sister were there. Along came a Spanish Guardia Civil with the two passports, and he came, and matter of fact, he said, this one has been sent to Cádiz, that was Richard, and this one here has been sent to Carlos Ayas Hospital in Malaga. Very quickly, we made our way back home. We collected the few pesetas we had there, the necessary documentation. We collected our teenage daughter, who was up then. And before we left, I made several telephone calls, one of which was to my brother-in-law, the doctor, who had a practice in Nueva Andalucía and lived on the Malaga side of Estepona. I told him what I knew, and being a doctor, I asked him to find out whatever he could. We made our way. We didn't have mobile phones in those days. And of course, the vehicles didn't have airbags either. As we rounded one of the bends near Sotogrande, this was the monument that caught our eye. My wife screamed. My daughter announced that she was feeling sick, and I could barely keep my foot on the accelerator pedal. We judged for a while, and I was tempted to stop and look at the car. But I wanted to get to my brother-in-law in Estepona as quickly as possible and find out what the position was. We arrived there to find my sister crying and my brother-in-law very seriously telling me that he had been in touch with the hospital, and they said that Mark was in a serious condition, but fortunately he was alive. He saw the state that we were in, and he said, "You're not driving, I'm driving there." I was so glad, because being a doctor, he knew the medical protocol in Spain, which I ignored completely, never having dealt with Spain medically. And we made our way there. We arrived at Urgencias after what seemed an eternity. All the way he was reassuring us that the hospital had an excellent record of traumatología, which is where Mark was going to end. He made his way into the unit, came out immediately, and did the thumbs up, and told us that Mark was okay, and we were allowed to go in. The picture was not a pretty picture at all. Mark was lying on the bed with his leg outstretched. He was in traction. He had broken the femur, the longest and strongest bone of our body, and he had a hairline fracture of the pelvis. His arm was also immobilized. Some of the small bones of the wrist had also been misplaced, and he wasn't allowed to move that. His head was bejeweled with looked like diamonds, obviously pieces of glass on his head. And his body was completely covered in lacerations, a lot of which had already been sutured. Mark was awake, which was a good sign. He was falling to sleep and awake. And when his mother asked him, "Do you know who we are?" "Of course," he said, "Mum, of course I know who you are." That to us was a good sign. We were to spend a number of weeks in that hospital. Luckily, we found a place across the hospital, which was known as La Casa de Enfrente, and it was going to be our home for the next week or so. The neurosurgeon couldn't decide whether the bump on the head that he had received had caused any internal damage. And I noticed that his eye was sticking out, practically out of the socket. When I looked closely, the pupil was totally dilated, and that pupil was going to remain dilated for many, many months afterwards. Eventually, the neurosurgeon said, "Yes, okay, we can go ahead with the rest of the surgery." And about 3 or 4 days after being in that intensive care unit where we saw horror pictures there of other families in the same plight as we were. On the advice of my brother-in-law, we moved him to a private clinic because I had an insurance, a family insurance. And he said that that was the done thing in Spain. And the reason that we moved him there was not because he was going to have better medical treatment there, but simply because he would be having a room of his own with 2 beds, one for himself and one for the acompañante, which was going to be my wife. I came over to Gibraltar, paid a visit to the bank. Obviously, we needed cash. In those days, we didn't have cards, debit or credit cards, and inform the family, and also try and find out how Richard was doing in Cádiz. Richard was still in a coma, and Richard was going to remain in a coma for many, many weeks, if not months after that. Mark was operated, everything went well, and after a couple of weeks, he was sent back to Gib. We went to the Royal Naval Hospital because at the time I was working here for the Ministry of Defence. And I was tasked with translating the medical report that came from Spain. I had to resort to my knowledge of physiology and anatomy and to my grammar school knowledge of Latin to be able to decipher that. It was a tremendous task for me. He didn't stay long at that hospital. It was more cosmetic than anything else. He was discharged from there as well. And the first thing he wanted to do was to visit Richard in Cadiz. So having spent time in the big Carlos Sajas Hospital, then in the clinic, then in the Royal Naval Hospital here, we spent quite a bit of time seeing Richard. Mark would sit there by his side, talk to him, crack jokes, played the sort of music that they enjoyed together. And we did this for many, many days. At first, because it was term time, we had to do it over the weekends. The picture that Richard presented was an even uglier one than the one that Mark had presented. Richard had his eyes completely open, but unseeing. He was attached to all sorts of instruments and machines. And Richard was not responding at all. And this was after about 3 or 4 weeks after the accident. Richard was to remain in that state for many, many weeks, as I said before. I noticed that his muscles were beginning to atrophy, and his legs and arms were acquiring a funny shape. His chest seemed to be well up here, and he was having great problems breathing and making very, very funny noises. But there was absolutely no response from him, despite the fact that a team of nurses would come regularly to move his limbs, move his joints, and get him going. I see time is running out. Richard wanted me to say today that he'll remain eternally grateful to his parents who are no longer with us now. And he's sure that when he came to, it was mainly his parents that really supported him and gave him the sort of life he was able to come back after so many months to the land of the living. This took, as I said, a number of months. When Julian asked me for a title for this talk, I thought of a parent's dilemma or a parent's, I can't remember what I told you now, but I think perhaps a parent's nightmare, I think, would have been more correct to have used there. And if I considered my experience a nightmare, I could only just imagine what Richard's parents must have felt like, having spent there all those months, seeing Richard deteriorating fast, and not seeing the daily progress that we saw with Mark. We gave a talk to something like this, only much more elaborate, to many school children, with attack of health and safety in it, warning children that riding a bike or driving a car is really using a killing vehicle, the potential of a killing vehicle. It's an experience that I think will always be there. We talk about it now, and we have many, many anecdotes, things that made us laugh afterwards, things that we saw whilst in the hospital, things that we heard, and other experiences. But that obviously will have to be the content of yet another talk, because I see I've got only 41 seconds left now for the end of my talk now. Thank you very much for listening to this now, and I wish you a good day. Thank you.